Now, one question you might be asking though is, okay, so there's being language declines, and half of the world's languages are going to go extinct by 2100. But you might say, why is that a concern though? A big thing that anthropologists will always bring up is there's not like per se better or worse languages typically. For the most part, human languages, they're sort of equally effective. Sometimes they're better at different things, but they all kind of do what they're supposed to do as far as allowing a group to communicate. So why does it matter if people are sort of switching, especially nowadays when we don't have things like these like forced boarding school processes at play? You might ask, why does it matter if people are switching from native languages to bigger languages like English? And I want you to stop and I want you to think about that. And how you think about that may have a lot to do with what community you're personally from, or maybe it doesn't. But think about what happens when a native language is lost. And to think about that, you kind of need to think about more generally what languages do for people, including especially indigenous people. So I put down a few thoughts here. Languages help forge group identity, right? Being able to speak Koyukan, being able to speak Yupik, helps reinforce one's sense of being part of those specific cultures. I put languages convey stories. There are sometimes, for some cultures like Zuni down in the Southwest, there are languages that, stories or song stories that can only really be done properly in that native language. That's sort of the sacred language in which this story is conveyed. So when you lose the language, you're losing the stories. In other cases, you can do the stories in English, but something is lost, right? Something's lost in translation, because one thing we know is that languages do not always one-to-one translate. Oftentimes, there's terms that don't fully pull across languages. The example from Denina that we read earlier in the semester of Begesh and Begesha is a really good example. So is the Tlingit from the Angun reading when she was talking about atun, that kind of like ownership balance concept. There's concepts that don't fully translate, and so to convey the story in another language perhaps doesn't do it justice. And certainly it's a sense of perhaps disconnectedness to not be able to do it in the native language that it was originally spoken in and has been spoken for centuries. In that point, languages connect us to ancestors. I love this book, Wisdom Sits in Places by Keith Basso, and he talks about how he was mispronouncing an Apache word, and he said, well, it's okay, I'll get it later. An Apache friend of his said, no, it does matter. That's the speech of our ancestors. So when we take a native language and start speaking it when we are a native person, and I hope I'm explaining this correctly since I'm not, but languages connect us to our ancestors is what I hear from a lot of native folk that I've interacted with and native writers and things. Language connects us to landscape. Oftentimes specific languages, as you've read about in a couple of the readings, specific languages have specific types of names for specific types of places. And sometimes those place names are really rich, right? They describe the place really well, physically or geomorphologically, in a way that just calling it Barrow, Alaska, maybe doesn't, right? So there's power in the native terms for things. And then languages contain cultural teachings, both simple and profound. Again, kind of that idea that things don't always translate. And there's terms, a lot of times kind of central religious or sacred concept, like atun, like begesh or begesha, which don't really fully come across even when you try to explain them in English. And a lot of times native bilingual speakers will say, well, yeah, here's how I would translate it in English, but it still doesn't really kind of have the oomph. It doesn't really get it across right. And so language codes teaching. So again, we kind of lose a world when we lose words. It's not that you can't translate across languages, but that's always an imperfect process. And even if you can, you've lost sort of that sense of shared identity that happens when a native community retains its language. So that's a big concern, I think, for a lot of both scholars and native communities. And that might help kind of explain why a lot of native communities around Alaska expend pretty significant amounts of money and effort trying to do these kinds of language programs like you read about in the Haida reading. It kind of reminds me of something called the Peoplehood Matrix. So this was something in a paper by these three people, Holm, Person, and Chavez. It was a paper written by indigenous and non-indigenous scholars working together, and they kind of talked about this idea of there's really kind of four critical elements for an indigenous nation or an indigenous culture to kind of have a distinct cohesive sense of themselves as a people. And they talked about religion, or if you don't prefer that term, just kind of sacred ceremonies. They talked about land, some kind of territory, whether they currently occupy it or not, but some sense of a territory. A history, or rather a sacred history that connects you to that place. But then the fourth component of it is language, and they say the language aspect of it is actually really important. It kind of undergirds all the other things, because language is often what the ceremonies are done in. It often connects to the sacred stories. It's often how one relates to the land. So language is powerful, right? And it's not that if without language you don't have a culture by any means, but it is to say that language significantly strengthens a culture's distinctiveness. Given all of that, where do we kind of stand today with Alaska Native languages or with Native American languages more generally? So this is old data, partly because it's been 10 years since we've had good census data. We now have a new census coming out, of course. But 2011 census told us that 72% of Native American homes at that time spoke only English at home. 15% were actively speaking a Native American language at home. So that tells you a couple of things. One, it tells you these languages are definitely not gone, and there's definitely still people where that's the primary language they speak in. But it also tells you there's been a huge language shift over the last couple of centuries, where English as a language is just sort of overwhelmingly taken over. And occasionally Spanish or other languages, depending on the household. I think this is Linguistic Society of America, is all I'll say. They report that there's about 300 native languages in what we think of as the United States and Canada, and that if we look at those, about 100 have gone extinct. About 200 remain. Of those 200, though you might say, well, that's bad, but we've still got 2/3. But you've also kind of got to look at not just the language extinction, but like I was saying a second ago, the language shift. So look at the ages of people speaking. 25% of those are spoken mainly by people over 70. 38% mainly by people over 50. So add those together, and what we've got is that about 60% of, just over 60% of these languages, and this is data's a few years old, is spoken primarily by people that are over 50 years old, and a quarter by people over 70. When you consider the lifespan of human beings, and the fact that most people in these age ranges probably aren't actively having or raising children, some are, of course, what we come away with is the idea that a whole lot of the language speakers remaining for some of these languages are at risk of aging out and passing if that language doesn't get transmitted. So that's a big concern. Only 17% are sort of actively spoken by adults and children. Now, I kind of want to clarify, because a lot of these languages have made significant efforts. So, for example, Chickasaw. I had students down when I taught in Texas who were Chickasaw, obviously, because we were right near the Oklahoma border. So you get a lot of students that were Chickasaw, and Chickasaw tribe has a lot of like creative programs, like word of the day emails or like language app on your phone kind of stuff. And so I think there's a lot of these languages that are starting to revitalize more. But when we say 17%, what we're, I think, more talking about is especially ones where it's sort of being actively, regularly spoken. But hopefully we're trying to turn that trend around, and I wouldn't be surprised if the number's a little bit larger now that, again, the data's a few years old.